On this presentation, we're going to be looking at how markets perhaps don't do quite as much as we would want them to do. So let's start off by looking at how markets are supposed to work. Now remember, free markets act broadly without government interaction, and there are three economic agents apart from the government. There are consumers, whose aim is to maximise their welfare, in other words, their consumer surplus. Producers, whose aim is to maximise their welfare, in other words, profits, our producer surplus, and workers, whose aim is to maximise their wages. Now let's take a scenario where consumers decide that they want sensible cardigans, things on the left, rather than stupid sagging trousers, the things on the right. So with more demand, the price of sensible cardigans will go up, and the profits made by sensible cardigan producers will also rise. On the stupid sagging trousers side, they're going to find the opposite of that occurring. Now those higher profits will be used to attract new firms into the industry for sensible cardigans. Existing firms will also wish to produce more. Now, in order to produce more, the new firms and the existing firms are going to need labour. Now, on the other side, some firms are going to have gone out of business, so that would have released some labour. So how do the sensible cardigan producers get those workers? Well, they've got to offer them a higher wage rate. Now, labour loves high wages, so it's going to be attracted. Labour is, of course, going to be leaving on the other side, as a result of which, at the end of the day, you get more sensible cardigans supplied and you get fewer stupid sagging trousers provided, which is exactly what consumers wanted. What have I said about the government? Nothing. The government has no role in a free market. So in a free market, according to Adam Smith, we get the right allocation of resources led by consumer taste, or possibly by resource depletion. You get what's called consumer sovereignty. So who rules? It's the consumer. You get allocative efficiency. Now, allocative efficiency is where the combined welfares, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, is maximised. And it's dead easy to show that on a diagram. You draw a supply curve, you draw a demand curve, and the equilibrium point is that point of welfare maximisation. But because you've got lots and lots and lots of firms, they're going to be competing for resources. They're going to be competing to be best. So they're going to be looking after their costs. So you also get a least cost allocation of resources, which is productive efficiency. So that's how markets work. So what's market failure? Well, that's when the market inefficiently allocates scarce resources to meet the needs of society. You're never going to get a situation where you don't have some market failure. It's impossible to get a perfect resource allocation. Role of governments? Well, governments try to reduce market failure by intervening. Government intervention we look at elsewhere on the spec. And sometimes they get it wrong and they actually make a bad situation even worse. And if that happens, you get government failure. There are two types of market failure. If a market doesn't exist at all, then that is complete market failure. It's a missing market. It's where no goods or services are produced, even though there could be demand for them. And the reason for that is firms cannot receive revenue by supplying it, for example, street lighting. Partial market failure is where goods are produced, but they're not produced in an optimal manner. So, for example, merit goods are underproduced. So in a free market, some of you, for example, would not be able to afford your A-level education. Demerit goods tend to be overproduced, for example, cigarettes or alcohol. If we take an aside and look briefly at what government failure might look like, note might, well, occasionally you've drawn diagrams, say the tax diagram is the one on the left, and that yellow area is welfare loss. In other words, total welfare has fallen as a result of that indirect tax. On the right hand side, you've got the tariff diagram that you may know from your macro. Those two triangles labelled X and Y are the welfare loss caused by the tariff. Economists love triangles, but note this is not necessarily government failure. If they've reduced a market failure, by actions, but haven't completely eliminated it, well, they haven't failed. It would only be failure if at the end of the day society is worse off than before the government tried to intervene. Let's take a couple of macro examples of market failure. Now, I started from the scenario of where consumers wanted more sensible cardigans and fewer stupid sagging trousers. Well, there could perhaps be a collapse of confidence in the economy where they want neither sensible cardigans nor stupid sagging trousers. In other words, their demand for both of them goes down. So whereas on my original example, workers were leaving the stupid sagging trousers industry and moving into the sensible cardigans industry, in this case, they are leaving both sides. So we get mass unemployment, as occurred way back in the 1930s, but also in the financial crisis of the late 2000s and early 2010s. Or what if consumers are going on a spending spree and they want more of everything? Obviously, not everything can be produced if we're at full employment, and so then we get inflation. Now remember, free markets follow money, not morals or need. So there is absolutely nothing inconsistent in consumers wanting swimming pools and getting loads of swimming pools, even though other consumers haven't got the money to afford food or a roof over their head. Again, you tend to cover that in macroeconomics when you're looking at inequalities. So let's go micro. Well, a potential market failure could be caused by barriers to entry. Remember, if consumers want sensible cardigans, prices and profits rise, and those profits would attract new firms. But if you've got significant barriers to entry, they simply cannot join the market. So you get that deadweight loss. Again, it's almost a triangle on that diagram. That comes from a monopoly. So a monopoly is a classic example of market failure, assuming static economics rule and we don't look at dynamics. Now, a market failure that we do look at in this part of the course is to do with negative externalities. So again, let's take that scenario. Consumers want more sensible cardigans, prices and profits rise, those profits attract new firms. Now, what could those new firms be doing? Well, they could be producing cardigans. Yes, of course, that's what they're going to be doing. But also, the factories that are being used to produce the cardigans could pollute the skies and the rivers. The factories could well be noisy and disrupt local communities. And that will cause costs to other consumers and firms who had no part in the original decision to buy or not buy cardigans. So those are economic agents who are negatively affected by this decision to buy cardigans. They're what's called third parties. Or we could have positive externalities. So we are producing cardigans, but in order to produce those cardigans, we're going to need to train up the workers that we've just attracted. Now, once those workers are trained, they've got transferable skills, which they can then use to move jobs and go to another employer. So other employers benefit from the first employer's training. So that is a positive externality. So an economic agent who is not part of the transaction has positively benefited. So what about this weirdo concept of the non-existent market? Well, I want to be protected. I don't want to be bombed by someone, so I'm going to need an air force to protect me. However, if I consume that air force, there's still exactly the same amount of the air force available to you. It's what's called non-rival. So my consumption of it does not reduce the availability for you to consume. The opposite of non-rival is, of course, rival. If I buy a Mars bar from Tesco, then that reduces the number of Mars bars available to you. Air forces are not Mars bars. So not only is there exactly the same amount of air power after I have used my air power available for you, I can't stop you from benefiting from it. It's non-excludable. There's nothing I can do to prevent that aircraft that is protecting me from also protecting you. Obviously, with a Mars bar, you can be excluded because they can jack up the price of a Mars bar. So because that air force is non-rival and non-excludable, I'm not going to buy an airplane, and neither will you, and neither will anybody else. So the free market will not produce an air force at all. So finally, we need to look at information gaps, and that's where consumers do not have the information to make the right choice. So for example, consumers want sensible cardigans. Now, what they don't know is there's even better sweaters available for exactly the same price, but they're pretty stupid and they don't know that. So therefore, they won't buy the sweaters that would increase their utility still further. Now, again, another example. They want sensible cardigans. They get those sensible cardigans, but what they don't know is one of the materials used in the cardigans is going to turn their skin green in 5 years' time. Unless they can hop in a TARDIS, they wouldn't be able to find that out. So an information gap means that they could be making the wrong choice. Now, that's a pretty stupid example. But when we think of cigarettes, now in the old days, cigarettes obviously used to make people cough, and people believed that that was clearing their lungs. So they actually believed that cigarette consumption was a good thing. They weren't aware that it was going to give them cancers later on in life. So there was an obvious information gap there. So the cigarette firms did some research into it, and they did discover that cigarette smoking gives you cancer. So what did they do with that research? They suppressed it, so it didn't get into the hands of consumers because it would badly harm their business. So there was still an information gap, except in this particular case, it was the firms deliberately suppressing information. Nonetheless, consumers were still making the wrong decisions. So for my final example, I'm going to be generous and call it an information gap, and this is to do with the labour market. Women make up 51% of the population of this country. Ethnic minorities make up 14%. People called Stephen, I'm not sure on the numbers. I do know that it was the 99th top baby name for boys in 2019, way down from third in 1954. Well, you'd reasonably expect then, if women make up 51% of the community, that there'd be perhaps 40, perhaps 30 women CEOs in the FTSE top 100 firms. Nope, 6 women are in the CEO positions, and those 6 women on average earn 1/3 less than male CEOs. Only 1 in the top 25 of highest paid CEOs is a woman. There are only 5 ethnic minority CEOs out of the top 100. However, if you're called Stephen, 7 CEOs are called Stephen, 6 are called David. So if either you are a woman or an ethnic minority, I strongly suggest that you change your name and your gender to Stephen or David. Now, it could well be that that is deliberately done due to discrimination, or it could just be accidental because the people who are in charge of these companies tend to be white middle-aged males, and they tend to appoint white middle-aged males to similar posts. So why is this market failure? Well, if you're a racist or a sexist, you probably wouldn't regard it as market failure, but most sensible people aren't. Now, if you believe that non-white people are as good as white people and women are as good as men, then that means that these firms are making bad employment decisions. It means that they are going to be doing worse decisions and having higher costs than they need have. An estimate by Involve said that due to ethnic minority discrimination, the UK economy is losing £2.6 billion every year. And obviously, as you can see there, the situation for women in terms of discrimination is far worse than that for ethnic minorities. So the position there is going to be a whole lot higher. So that would be market failure, because you are not making productively efficient, and because they're making worse decisions, they're unlikely to be able to meet the needs for consumers as well as a non-biased situation would be. And that seems like a nice place to finish today.